let's now talk about the next part of the Zippy Microservice structure and functionality, and this is going to focus on the JPA Quote Repository, and we're going to show how it applies the Jakarta Persistence API, JPA. And we're also going to give an overview of the Spring Data API, which is absolutely fascinating. So let's start off with that first. So if those of you who've done traditional database programming using SQL, you undoubtedly know that SQL stands for Structured Query Language, and it's essentially a declarative way of being able to program, to create and read and update and delete entities, rows in tables. And it's not the most complicated thing in the world, but it has a lot of accidental complexity and is rather low level. So it doesn't look much like programming in the traditional sense of the word. So to make life easier for programming, Spring defines this thing called the Data API, which is a framework that makes it easier to implement the data access layer or layers in Spring-based applications. So Spring Data JPA is basically Spring plus database access. And the way this works is developers write so-called repository interfaces that define the data access methods that they need. And this is super interesting and cool how it works. So there's basically a bunch of naming conventions. And depending on how you name the methods you put into this interface, it will end up automatically generating the corresponding SQL queries that will then be run against the database tables in order to be able to find the contents in the database. And you can see that there's a bunch of keywords like containing, not, in, starting with, ending with. And so what it'll show you is these are the keywords. This is how you could put the keywords together into a method name that you defined, like find by first name not like, or find by first name containing. And then it shows you the corresponding SQL that will be automatically generated to represent what the query method is trying to do. So as long as you can put together syntactically valid names of methods using these keywords, then Spring's Data API will automatically generate the queries under the hood. So when those methods are invoked, they will end up querying against the underlying database tables. So super, super cool. Basically, it reduces boilerplate code needed to implement persistence and data access layers in Java applications. So it's kind of a low-code-like way of doing things. You don't have to write a lot of code. All right, so armed with that knowledge about what the Spring Data API is, let's now talk about the quote repository. So the quote repository, or the JPA Quote Repository, is a Jakarta Persistence API-based repository that contains a database of quote objects. Remember when we looked at quote, when we walked through the code, I said, notice quote's a class, but it's got all these funny annotations on it. We didn't really talk about those annotations now. At that point, we're now going to talk about what those annotations mean here shortly, and you'll see how this all works. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a class that we implement called JPA Quote Repository, and that's annotated as a repository. So that tells Spring that this class, the JPA Quote Repository, will automatically obtain the mechanisms to store, retrieve, search, update, and delete, the so-called CRUD operations, which I always thought were pretty funny. CRUD stands for create, read, update, and delete on objects or rows in the database. This is all part of sort of what's often referred to as object relational mapping. We get this capability, our JPA Quote Repository here, by extending the JPA repository. JPA repository is an interface, and you can see here that this is going to tell the repository it's going to have a table of quotes, because those are the handy quotes, or sorry, the Zippy quotes now, and they're going to be keyed by integers. That's what this says. And then something else we're going to talk about, not right this second, but later, because we'll have enough time, is something that we write called multi-query repository, which is going to provide a custom way of querying that's more powerful than we get out of the box. And we'll talk more about that shortly. Then we're going to define a method called find by quote containing ignore case. And you're like, that's a bit of a mouthful. Exactly, that's the whole point. This is written using the keywords from the Spring Data API. So find by says query, and query, you want to find things by quotes, and you want them to have containing this query string, but you want to do the comparison ignoring the case. So that declarative statement says what you want, right? This is that classic thing about the how versus the why, or sorry, the what versus the how. And what happens here is this what is then automatically converted into this query. So this is the actual SQL query that will be run against the database when someone invokes this method. And basically what it says is select anything from the quote table where the quote that happens to be in the quote table is like the query, this thing here. So again, if you were an expert in SQL, you would know what this stuff meant. But who the heck cares what SQL does under the hood? We can write at a higher level. By the way, if you're curious how I knew what this was, I typed this into ChatGPT, this declarative method with the parameters and the return value, and I said, please show me the corresponding SQL query that the Spring Data API would generate from this. And boom, it did that, which was pretty darn cool. So that's a quick walkthrough of the JPA repository feature and how you can use the Spring Data API in order to declaratively specify what you want your queries to be using Java method syntax where the keywords that you use map onto the Data API semantics so that magic things happen for you under the hood.